Hey guys, I'm Andrew with thedirtytank.com, and today I want to tell you my 7 tips on how to keep Neocaridina shrimp alive and thriving. So I currently keep and breed hundreds of shrimp that I keep for myself and also ship and sell across the nation. And it wasn't too long ago where I couldn't keep a shrimp alive. I just couldn't. After a couple weeks, they'll slowly all die off one by one by one. If you're in this situation to where you can't keep your shrimp alive, let me show you the 7 tips that I have here of what I do now that helps me have the colony of shrimp that I have now. So tip number 1, and this is just something I noticed, that shrimp tend to do better when they're in larger groups, right? And so, you know, the traditional thinking is, I'm not sure if I can keep a shrimp alive, so let me just get 1 or 2, because if they die, I'm not losing a ton, it's only just 1 or 2. And that could work, and there's nothing wrong with that way of thinking. But I would say once you feel comfortable and you kind of implement all these tips that I'm about to tell you, buy a group of about 10, right? 10 or 12 is a good starting set to help really grow your colony. I think the more you have, the more comfortable they feel. And there's just something about that amount of shrimp that I tend to see whenever I'm starting up a new tank with shrimp, that they just seem to thrive better and quicker. Now, step number 2, I think this is really important. A lot of people don't do this too often, and they tend to only do it with shrimp, and I think you should do it for all your fish, shrimp included. Tip number 2 is to drip acclimate your fish. Now, to drip acclimate, it's really easy. It's not expensive, right? When you think of drip acclimation, you think it takes a while. You think you have to do it for an hour, or that you need fancy equipment. But all you need is airline tubing and the little nozzle that goes on the airline tubing. That's it. So if you go to Amazon.com or if you go to your local pet store, you just need to get an airline tubing kit. It costs like 15 bucks. You're gonna get like 25 feet of airline tubing and all these little connectors and attachments. You just need like a foot of it and then 1 connector, that's it. And you can use that to slowly drip in water to your container to where you have your shrimp so they can slowly be acclimated to your tanked water. And so let me give you a good example of this, of why drip acclimation is important. So I do aquarium maintenance on the side, and I was testing the pH of one of my clients' aquarium, and their pH was at 3.5. Now, they have discus, so they like lower pH, that was fine, and their fish are thriving in that water. But if I were to get one of my fish, right, the pH in my tanks is about 7.5. And if I were to just float them in the water and they just get acclimated to her tank's temperature, but none of that water, they didn't get acclimated to the water, the difference in pH from 7.5 to 3.5 is significant, right? And the likelihood that there's going to be problems with the fish that I put in there is going to be very, very, very high. And so drip acclimation does 2 things. It slowly introduces that fish or shrimp into the new temperature plus the new water chemistry, right? pH included. And that's something that floating can't do. And so I think when it comes to shrimp, you definitely want to drip acclimate. It's not that difficult. It's not that expensive once you have the setup, and it's easy to get the setup. I normally only drip my shrimp for about 15 to 20 minutes. Some people do it for hours. Some people do it for 45 minutes. Some people say never go under 30 minutes. I've been doing it for a while for 15 minutes, and that's been working for me, and I haven't lost any shrimp that way. Now, tip number 3, this is something that you need to add to your fish tank, to your shrimp tank. And you don't have to always add it, kind of depends, but if you're like me and you have softer water that doesn't have a lot of trace minerals in it, then your shrimp isn't going to survive that well because it doesn't have the calcium it needs to molt, right? So many times when I was starting off in shrimp keeping, I would see the ring of death, right? Where there was essentially a failed molt, right? Every so often, as the shrimp grows, it molts off its exoskeleton and grows a new one. Well, if that exoskeleton doesn't fall off appropriately, if you get stuck on him, then that shrimp is essentially just stuck in there and he won't be able to move and he'll slowly die. To help make sure you don't have failed molts, you need to have enough calcium and other minerals in your tank to, I guess, make sure that doesn't happen and to make sure that your shrimp thrive. Now, you don't have to spend a ton of money like you hear some people do with their shrimp tanks. You don't need to add, and you don't need to be a chemist by any means. What I do is very simple. All I do is get a handful of crushed coral. You can buy a whole bag of crushed coral online for like 20 bucks, right? I think a 20 pound is about $20 or $30, and that will last you for, I mean, you can probably set up 50 tanks with a 20 pound bag of crushed coral. You just need one handful. You kind of sprinkle it in there, either right there on top of the substrate, or you can put it at the bottom layer and then cover it up with the substrate, or you can put it in the back of your hang-on back filter, or you can put it in a little sack and then put it in the corner somewhere in your fish tank. It doesn't matter. I've tried all those methods and all of them work. So there isn't a special place that you need to put it. It just needs to get into that water somehow, so that your shrimp can start benefiting from all the calcium and minerals that it can provide. Now, tip number 4 is to have live plants. So there's going to be fluctuations within water chemistry, right? Nitrite, ammonia, and live plants help provide a good buffer. So that's one thing that live plants can do, just a consistent absorbing all the excess nutrients. So if you don't do water changes as regularly, or maybe when you should or too early or too late, whatever it happens to be, you kind of have that buffer, and having live plants is really good, not only for that health benefit of the water, but at the same time, different types of plants help capture different debris, and algae grows on them, and there's all sorts of stuff, biofilm, all of that. And all of that the shrimp likes to eat and graze and munch on, because shrimp, they scavenge 24/7. And so having some type of food source in the tank at all times is needed. Now, you don't want to feed your shrimp all the time, no, but there needs to be some kind of food source that isn't going to spoil. And a good form of that is normally going to be algae and biofilm. Plants normally help, I guess, house that to some extent. And in addition to that, especially if you have floating plants are really cheap, and they're really indestructible. You just place them on the top of your tank and they float around. You have dwarf water lettuce, duckweed, red root floater, Salvinia minima, frogbit. There's tons and tons of floating plants. And what'll happen is the roots will hang down in the water. And as the current is kind of going out and about, it will catch some debris. And so I see my shrimp all the time on the root system of my floating plants, just picking away at any debris that they can munch on. So I think having live plants is needed, and it really goes a long way into helping make sure your shrimp thrive. Now, if I were to recommend specific plants, it's going to be floating plants. It's going to be Java moss, because it does the same thing. It's all mossy and it captures all the gunk, and your shrimp like eating all the gunk. And I'd also recommend subwassertang. Subwassertang is just like Java moss. It's just kind of a clump that kind of captures all the gunk, but it's a little bit different. You don't see it too much, but shrimp love climbing all through it and just grazing on all the food and all the stuff that kind of gets trapped in there. Now, tip number 5, you normally don't hear too often, but I think it's pretty important if you're looking to grow a large colony of shrimp. And that is to have a heater in your tank that is adjustable, and you want to set that heat to around 77, 78 degrees. And the reason why I say you need a heater, especially when a lot of times you can put shrimp in a heaterless fish tank and it's just heated by the atmosphere in your house. So they technically don't need a heater, depending on where you live and where you're going to have the aquarium. But they do reproduce, and they are a lot more active in higher temperatures. So the higher the temperature is, to an extent, you don't want to go over nothing in the 80s. But the higher the temperature, the quicker your colony is going to grow, the more active they're going to be as well. And so if you want to grow a colony pretty quickly, then I would suggest setting the temperature of your tanks anywhere between 77 degrees and 78 degrees. And this will allow them to kind of reproduce a lot quicker. They're going to be very, very energetic, very running around, scavenging, eating a lot of things. This also means that their appetite is going to increase a little bit. And so with this, you may want to feed a little bit more, not much more, because they still are incredibly small creatures. But you just got to be cognizant of what temperature will do to your shrimp, right? Their appetite is going to increase a little bit. And you're going to have a lot more shrimp in a much quicker, sooner time, which means you're going to have just more little creatures to feed. So setting your temperature a little bit higher goes a long way in helping to build a large and happy colony of shrimp. Now, tip number 6, and this is, a lot of people know this one, but this is one that I always hear questions about, and this is normally where people run into issues, and that's when you do a water change, right? How many times have you had shrimp and they were doing just fine? They looked all nice and happy. You did a water change and then they started acting funny, and then the next day you lost 1 or 2 or 3 or half your colony or whatever it may be. And so shrimp are pretty sensitive to changes in water chemistry. And so I recommend doing small water changes, and you want the water coming in to be about the same temperature as the tank is already. And this is another reason why it's important to not chase pH and I guess other water chemistry parameters, because if you can get your shrimp adapted to the water where you live, then whenever it comes time to do a water change, well, the water's not that much different. And so there isn't going to be any kind of shock that could be detrimental to your shrimp. And so whenever you're doing a water change, I would recommend maybe about a 10 or 15% water change. And you don't have to do them that often either, right? I know some people that do them every single week. I think that's a little excessive, and it kind of depends on your setup, right? Do you have fish with your shrimp, right? Then you may want to do water changes a little bit more regularly. But if not, you can maybe get away with every other week to maybe once a month. It all depends on the bio load, the size of the tank, your filtration, how many plants. So I can't give you a hard and fast number of how frequently you should do it, but you can definitely get away with pushing it a little bit further, especially if it's a shrimp only tank. Now, tip number 7 is to have a sponge filter, right? So shrimp are little tiny, they don't get longer than maybe 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, so they don't get very big. And so they can easily be sucked up in some of the hang-on back filters or canister filters. And so if you have a sponge filter, it makes it really easy to grow a colony of shrimp without sucking up those babies. Now, you don't have to get a sponge filter if you already have your own filtration system in place. If you have a hang-on back or a canister filter, what you want to make sure you have, and a lot of them come with this, but you want to make sure you have a pre-filter sponge on the outlet. So wherever the water is sucked into, you want to make sure there's just a nice sponge fitted over that. And it's normally called a pre-filter sponge. So if you don't have one of those, I would recommend getting those, and that will help make sure that the little baby shrimp that are gonna be running around in your tank, if you happen to keep shrimp for longer than a month, that they don't get sucked up and either killed or just living in your filter at that point. So I do have one bonus tip. So if you're here this long, then you get a tip that most people aren't getting. And that's just making sure that your shrimp aren't getting eaten by other fish that you may have in your tank. And so you want to make sure that you get fish that aren't going to munch on your shrimp. Now, generally you just want a peaceful fish that doesn't get very large And normally that's all you need to go by to make sure that fish isn't going to eat your shrimp. But even if they can't eat an adult shrimp, that doesn't mean they can't eat the babies, because they definitely will. And so there's a couple things to look out on how you can deal with that. And one is to get even smaller fish that can kind of handle that, right? Some of your smaller tetras, maybe ember tetra, maybe even some endlers. Those are really good at not picking off your shrimp. But the biggest thing is just having a lot of dense vegetation kind of lower to the ground. So maybe there's a couple spots of just Java moss, or maybe there's a whole row of different stem plants like Bacopa, Rotala, or whatever it happens to be. You need some dense places of vegetation to where these shrimp can kind of hide into and thrive. And so even if you do have slightly larger fish that could pick off some of the fry, they're not going to decimate your population enough for you to lose all your shrimp. A good example is the 20-gallon fish tank that I have. I have wild type cherry shrimp in there, and I also have X-ray tetras in there. And the X-ray tetras, I catch them munching on the baby shrimp all the time. But one thing that I notice is that as soon as I turn on the light, I see all the baby shrimp out and about, and they start running to go into all the vegetation, all the plants. And the ones that don't go fast enough, well, they get munched on. But once they're in that Java moss or that Java fern or the cryptocorin, whatever it happens to be, once they're undercover, the X-ray tetra can't really get them. X-ray tetra isn't, and most tetras aren't really going to hunt down shrimp. Just if they're there in an open space, they're going to get munched on. And so that's kind of your tip on how you can have shrimp with other fish, and some things to look out for and some things you can do. Well guys, that's going to wrap up today's video. I hope you enjoyed the tips here. And if you want more tips just like this one, click the link in the description below to join my free newsletter that's going to help you become a better fish keeper in 10 minutes per week. Thanks guys. I'll see you next time.